With two Super GPU launches earlier in July, Nvidia now completes the trio with the RTX 2080 Super. So let's look back at the earlier cards just for a moment. Essentially, the 2060 and 2070 Super were upgraded models using tech from higher-end RTX cards to boost performance and value. 2080S isn't quite so interesting. To cut a long story short, you're looking at around 10% of extra performance compared to a stock RTX 2080 and less than that if you stack it up against a factory overclocked edition like Nvidia's own Founders card here. So let's get down to brass tacks. The 2080 Super's improved horsepower is provided by upgrades to key specifications. For starters, it's the first consumer card using a fully enabled TU104 GPU with all of its 3072 CUDA cores active. That's an increase of just 128 cores over the standard 2080. So that's a small improvement to overall compute, but it is aided by a fairly meaty increase to boost clock on top of that. New higher-end GDDR6 sees memory data rate rising from 14 to 15.5 gigabits per second, providing a corresponding boost in memory bandwidth from 448 to 496 gigabytes per second. And in our testing, that's only the beginning of the memory bandwidth increase that's possible with this card. All of these changes are reflected in a moderately higher TDP. So the new card is rated at 250 watts compared to the 215 of the original 2080. Despite the higher power usage, there are only cosmetic design changes between the 2080 and 2080 Super Founders cards. New model has the distinctive reflective finish between its two axial fans, but it uses the same two-slot design as its predecessors and feels just as reassuringly solid in the hand. The I/O ports lineup also remains unchanged, with 3 display ports, 1 HDMI port, and a USB-C virtual link. Power comes from a 6-pin and an 8-pin PCI Express input. We didn't really expect changes here, except maybe the inclusion of a spoiler or some flame decals, but it's good to confirm that, well, everything is present and correct. It's fascinating to see how Nvidia has used its 3-core RTX processor designs to reshuffle the stack with the Super range. The bottom-end TU106 is used on RTX 2060 and its Super equivalent, while the 2070 Super gets an upgrade to the more powerful TU104, the same chip that's used in 2080 and indeed 2080 Super. Not every chip that rolls off the production line is perfect, so the defective ones can have CUDA cores disabled, and these can be sent out of the factory as RTX 2070 Super. RTX 2080 always used a slightly pared back version of the processor, but now the fully unlocked chip is utilized, backed by the fastest GDDR6 memory available to Nvidia. These hardware upgrades should guarantee better performance, but how much of a boost are we actually talking about? Nvidia dominates the high end here. AMD's Radeon 7 is virtually an irrelevance now, so all of our benchmarks in this video will be from Team GeForce. But fear not, Navi, Radeon 7 and more GPUs are all covered in the accompanying Eurogamer review, and there's a link for that in the description. You'll also find 1080p benchmarks there, which I'm not going to cover much in this review because, well, let's take a look at how 2080 Super scales across resolutions by comparing 1080p, 1440p and 4K performance on the same content. And this Assassin's Creed Odyssey benchmark illustrates the issue. Got an i7 8700K here with fast RAM and an all-core overclock to 4.7 GHz. But your performance differential between 1080p and 1440p isn't great. In fact, at this point, the two resolutions are perilously close. This is nothing to do with Nvidia's GPU and everything to do with the CPU. Only at 4K are we actually limited by the graphics technology. I'd imagine that ultra-wide 1440p and 1600p would also be a good fit for the 2080S, not just 4K. But I digress. And there's exactly the same issue here in Battlefield 5. Play this at 1080p and basically you're introducing stutter from being CPU limited and you're leaving a ton of GPU horsepower on the table. I reckon we may well be even CPU limited here at points in the 1440p benchmark too. Again, only at 4K are we seeing the 2080 Super running flat out. And yeah, The Witcher 3 again demonstrates the issue with running a too powerful GPU at a low resolution. Hitching and stuttering is the preserve of being CPU limited for the most part. And again, just looking at the frame time graph here, there's outright stalling and inconsistency all round at both 1080p and even 1440p resolution. Only on the red 4K line do we see consistency. If only every game could give us the CPU overhead offered by Rebellion's Strange Brigade. This one seems to be GPU limited from start to finish on all resolutions, and note the flat frame time line on the bottom right there. Also of interest here is the law of diminishing returns. Yes, 1080p has a significantly higher frame rate, but the actual delta between 1080p and 1440p per frame draw times is only about 1 or 2 milliseconds. Think about that for a second. Still, let's dig into the benchmarks and see what we can see. Spoilers though, don't go into this one expecting the kind of boosts seen on prior RTX supercards. Gonna kick off with Metro Extras here, the initial Volga scene being quite the test for both CPU and GPU, but we are mostly limited by graphics power here at 1440p. You can see my chosen comparison points here, 2070 and 2080 Super, alongside the standard 2080, in this case a Founders Edition with a factory overclock. And yes, the all-powerful 2080 Ti Founders is in there too. What interests me here are the power band groupings. You can see that the TU104 cards occupy their own area in the graph, while the 2080 Ti powers ahead into the next power band above. And essentially in the lower band it's 2080 Super, followed by 2080, followed by 2070 Super. Across the bench, the new 2080S commands a 14-point lead over 2070S. And here's where the price to performance ratio starts to look a little bit off, because you're paying 40% more for that 14-point advantage. Meanwhile, gains over the 2080 Founders, which, as I said, did have a factory overclock in place, the increase is just 4.5% on the Super. The groupings tighten up at 4K of course, but the percentage differentials are still similar. I guess the thing is that the 2080 Super isn't really like the other Supers. The perf bump is more iterative. So, can the prodigious memory bandwidth of the 2080 Super translate into any tangible performance improvements at all? Well, there is my benchmark from Battlefield 1 here, and what's curious is that the 2070 Super and 2080 sit in their own power band there at the bottom, but the 2080 Super delivers a much more interesting result here, sitting at a midpoint there at 1440p. It's no one-off either, as the groupings are even more pronounced as we shift to 4K resolution. This one surprised me, to be honest, and it is something of an outlier, but let's go with it. Curiously though, I don't see the same thing happening in Battlefield 5 running on the same Frostbite engine. I won't bother with 1440p here as we hit CPU limits far too often, but at 4K, the 2080S can only muster a 5.5% lead over the standard model. I think one thing to point out is that we can only benchmark the tiniest sliver of action from any given game. We can judge relative performance on the same content, but we can't guarantee in any way that different rendering scenarios in the same game won't deliver different results. And that's the same for any benchmarks out there, not just ours. Far Cry 5 next, and we encounter CPU limited scenarios on all cards even at 1440p, so the usual parallel lines we would expect are sabotaged by stutter, random stutter, most pronounced with the 2080 Ti, which desperately wants to power through but stalls most often because it's the most CPU bound. Balance is restored with the move to 4K, with the 2080 Super 15% ahead of the 2070S and 6% to the better against 2080 Founders. Once again though, the power bands speak for themselves. The 2080 Ti is ahead, and its lead here works out at around 18% over 2080 Super. Shadow the Tomb Raider next, a game with a great benchmark, but one that can throw up some curious results at the best of times. Results here though continue the trend we've already established of two power bands, effectively summed up by a TU104 grouping at the bottom and the TU102 line at the top, always dominating. At 1440p, 2080S is 13 points clear over 2070S, but only 4.5% ahead of the standard 2080 founders. 2080 Ti founders, 16.5% ahead. The percentage differentials don't shift much at 4K to be honest, though the RTX 2080 Ti fares better, increasing its lead over 2080 Super to a touch under 20%. I want to round off with a look at a couple of my legacy favourites. Assassin's Creed Unity is kinda interesting in that the power band groupings expand out a bit here. 2080 Super has a 6-point lead over 2080 at 1440p, with the Ti 17 points ahead. However, both 2080S and 2080 Ti fare better at 4K, with the new Super almost 9% ahead of our 2080 founders and the 2080 Ti 22% faster than 2080S. Now, I'm sure you know that I love Crysis 3, so here we go. 1440p initially. The results look promising, and to be fair, this is a GPU test until we reach this point. Close convergence between all of our graphics hardware here means that once again we're CPU bound at this point. And yeah, this area looks a bit dodgy too. Check out how the 2080 Ti crashes down there. So let's move on to 4K, where we're definitely in parallel lines territory, limited at all points by GPU. Memory bandwidth seems to help here with the Super 7 points clear of the factory overclocked 2080 founders. 2080 Ti though in a class of its own, 21% ahead of the new Super. All of which raises a fundamental question. We've got a pretty big gap here between 2080S and the 2080 Ti, so to what extent can we overclock the lower end card? Just how close can we get to Ti performance? Strange Brigade to begin with then, again with good clean scalability. I've added a 100 MHz core offset here and a whopping great plus 1250 MHz increase to the G6 memory, taking us up to a remarkable 18 gigabits per second on the modules. This surprised me, I have to say, and the end result is that the 2080S now occupies a midpoint between stock performance and 2080 Ti. Pretty much exactly the same at 4K too, though actually the overclock and the 2080 Ti both increase their advantage by a point or two over the stock 2080 Super. So I think we can be pretty clear here, no freebie 2080 Ti's for anyone based on this turnout, but still fairly respectable, right? A quick look at Battlefield 5 at 4K resolution here, where we can be basically guaranteed that our overclock won't bump us into CPU limitations. Increases 9% here over stock, but you'll note that we're closer to stock than to Ti here. The top end card 13% faster than our overclocked 2080 Super. Similar things occur in Metro Exodus, again running at 4K here. Overclocked 2080 Super is struggling to push ahead of the power band defined by the other TU104 based products, but it can only go so far. Overclocking yields a straight 9% improvement to stock performance, but even with that in place, the Ti has a clear 15% lead. Though, of course, it is a founder's card, so again, that will have a factory overclock in place, which will skew the results a touch. I also wanted to do some ray tracing tests too. Now, I'm not particularly happy using game benchmarks to do this, because I found that RT workloads vary radically, and on something like Shadow the Tomb Raider here, for example, well, the results kind of flatter to deceive. The thing about hybrid rendering is exactly that. You're combining standard rasterization techniques with ray tracing, and the balance between the two shifts constantly. So I'm going to revert here to a couple of actual benchmarks. 3D Mark Port Royal is designed to push ray tracing hard, and here we find the 2080 Super about 6.5% ahead of 2080 founders, with the 2080 Ti a good 18% ahead. With our plus 100, plus 1250 overclock in place, the deficit against the higher end card reduces to 10.3%. Again, not quite at the midway point, but a very useful boost nonetheless. Alex Battaglia, our PC specialist, put together this workout for the RT core in Quake 2 RTX, a fully path-traced rendition of the id Software classic. We're running at 1080p resolution here with high global illumination, and we're constantly adjusting the sun's position, which stops the game from using temporal accumulation to increase performance. So yeah, effectively this is around 50% of actual game speed, but it is fundamentally a thorough, purebred ray tracing workout. 2080 Super is just 5 points ahead of the 2080 Founders, but overclocking adds 11% versus the stock 2080S. Even with that in place though, 2080 Ti is still 16 points clear. An approximate 9 to 10% on overclocking is pretty much what you'd expect from an Nvidia Turing card. But make no mistake, the RTX 2080 Super is an upgraded 2080, not a cut down 2080 Ti. So, as for those rumours that it would be using TU102 silicon,
it's false. No way. Not this time. No, not this time. It's totally made up. Pure fiction. It's fiction. It's fiction. It's false. It's fiction. Not a chance. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. This one was invented by a writer.
Okay, so let's sum up then. Nvidia may have been in a bit of a tight spot in coming up with a super version of the RTX 2080. With 2060S and 2070S, the firm had the latitude to access features and silicon from the existing, more powerful 2070 and 2080 products. But for obvious reasons, Nvidia couldn't repeat the same trick here and leverage 2080 Ti's TU102 silicon. To do so may effectively make the 2080S too powerful for its price point, taking sales away from the Ti, which has no incoming replacement and no competition whatsoever from AMD. With that in mind, sticking with the TU104 made the most sense for Nvidia, but eking out considerably more performance for the Super proves to be rather more challenging this time around. Clearly it does the job, but the end result is a product that does what it needs to, but not much more. You can think of it as either a 10% performance boost over the older reference 2080 for the same price, or else a $100 price drop on the 2080 Founders with the added bonus of 5 to 6% uplift in frame rates, sometimes higher. That said, the 2080S also serves another purpose. The older 2080 perhaps sat too close to the still excellent 1080 Ti in performance terms in too many games. The new Super puts some welcome distance between a 2080 level card and the last gen top tier Ti. There isn't quite the same wow factor in terms of value as there is with the 2060 Super or its 2070 Super stablemates, and I still consider the $500 2070 Super as something of a winner, sitting in the same ballpark as Radeon 7 or 1080 Ti at a pretty attractive price point. Up against 2080 Super, an extra $200 buys you around 15% more performance at 4K and typically dropping a few points at 1440p. Clearly, 2080 Super is still considered a premium product by Nvidia, considering the 40% price increase over its stablemate, but this isn't matched by anything like that in performance terms. So yeah, a premium price product, but not a halo product. Those looking for the best of the best will still find the RTX 2080 Ti difficult to ignore, despite its super high price point. Overclocking 2080S adds performance of course, but the king of the hill remains untouchable. Now this is a Founders Edition product, so maybe partner cards will be able to deliver the power and the BIOS tweaks to push the TU104 beyond the 2.05 GHz ceiling I encountered when overclocking, and to deliver something a bit closer to 2080 Ti stock performance. But you know, in an ideal world I'd have really liked the 2080 Super to offer out of the box the kind of performance we got when overclocking it. And if that meant a price cut to the 2080 Ti, well, then happy days. But that's where I'm leaving things for now. Please do like and subscribe to support the work we do here at Digital Foundry, and ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a new DF video arrives on the channel. Follow us on Twitter for all of the latest updates. And yeah, once again, the DF Patreon. We need your help in producing the content we want to produce on our own terms. So please do consider that if you want to support the team more directly. But that's where I'm leaving things for now. Thanks for making it all the way through to the end, if indeed you did. And just generally, thanks for watching.